Ever since the Second World War, Europe has relied heavily on US leadership, security, and investment. But with recent presidents such as Trump and quarrels regarding foreign policy and trade, many in the EU believe that we can no longer solely rely on the US.
Und die Zeiten, in denen wir uns auf andere völlig verlassen konnten, die sind ein Stück vorbei. Das habe ich in den letzten Tagen erlebt. Und deshalb kann ich nur sagen, wir Europäer müssen unser Schicksal wirklich in unsere eigene Hand nehmen. Natürlich
In this video we'll cover the history of EU-US relations, the state of EU-US relations today, and our opinion on what we can expect in the future. After the Second World War, Western European countries were facing a lot of problems, such as the devastation of their economies, the strategic threat of the Soviet Union in the East, and the possible spread of communism. The United States also recognized these threats and sought to build a stronger economic and military relationship by providing $13 billion worth of economic recovery programs and by expanding NATO to include most Western European countries. The US also supported European unity and integration. In fact, they were the first non-member country to officially voice support for the European Coal and Steel Community, the first version of the EU, founded in 1951. Throughout the Cold War, the Transatlantic Alliance remained relatively strong. However, in 1991, at the end of the Cold War, some argue that the alliance died forever. The US, as the world's sole military and economic superpower, had global ambitions and focused their attention away from Europe. Since then, there were two main events that have challenged the transatlantic relationship. Firstly, the Iraq War, which was widely condemned in Europe and resulted in disdain and low public support between the two continents. And secondly, the Trump presidency, who saw the EU as a foe and implemented trade tariffs, threatened to leave NATO, left the Paris Climate Agreement, and was unrelenting in his criticism of the EU. Ultimately, Trump caused many Europeans to reconsider whether Europe was better off at going at it alone. So what about now with Biden in office? Well, the relationship has definitely improved with Biden's commitment towards rebuilding ties.
America is back. America is back. Diplomacy is back at the center of our foreign policy.
However, EU confidence in the US remains low. According to a 2021 survey, European citizens feel that the US political system is broken. China will become more powerful than the US within a decade, and that Europeans cannot rely on the US to defend them. In fact, of the data we have, only 3 EU countries see the US as the most important country to have a good relationship with. This would have looked very different during the Cold War 50 years ago. So, things have definitely changed. Yet the European Union still sees the US as a vital ally and has created an EU-US agenda with 4 key areas it wants to cooperate on. See my sources if you want more information on what actions there are behind each of these 4 areas. To make this EU-US agenda a reality, we believe the EU and the US face 4 key hurdles. The first hurdle, and probably the most urgent, is trade and investment. The US has recently passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which provides almost $370 billion worth of subsidies and tax cuts to American businesses to rely more on renewable energy sources. The EU is extremely worried, as this may cause EU-based companies to move manufacturing to the US. For example, Tesla already moved battery manufacturing from Germany back to the US. Some have even accused the US of war profiteering and violating trade rules, and the EU is now considering creating a European Inflation Reduction Act, which can result in a trade war of subsidies with the US. This is also part of a bigger problem for the EU, as individual member states like France want to create their own protectionist policies. And this will potentially threaten the entire EU single market. But this is a topic for another day. The second hurdle is China. Biden has called for the US and Europe to form a united political front against China and thereby shape its rise. But this is not the sentiment in Europe, where 66% of Europeans want to remain neutral if there's a disagreement between the US and China. Not to mention, the EU has a great dependency on China and has little interest in conflict. The third is defense. The US's sudden withdrawal out of Afghanistan and their secret defense agreement with Australia and the UK behind France's back has already annoyed EU allies. But the biggest concern is Trump's threat of withdrawing from NATO. If Trump were to be re-elected, this might be the catalyst for Macron's vision of an EU army to become a reality.
Europe can no longer leave its defense to the US. It is now up to us to take our own responsibility and to guarantee the safety and also therefore the sovereignty of the European Union.
And the fourth hurdle is a complete loss of trust in US democracy. Only 18% of Europeans believe that American democracy is a good example for other countries to follow, and one of Europe's main think tanks has already branded the US as a backsliding democracy. Trump's factually baseless questioning of the legitimacy of the 2020 election results was for many a historic turning point that undermined fundamental trust in the electoral process and resulted in the January 6 attack on the US Capitol. Therefore, there is currently not a lot of trust, and the EU cannot risk holding its breath every 4 years to see whether the transatlantic relationship does a 180. So in our opinion, these are the four main hurdles to a prosperous transatlantic relationship. The United States has proven an invaluable ally to the EU and is our second biggest trade partner, and it would be unwise to cut out such a strong power entirely. But we feel the EU needs to be prepared to become a leader on the world stage so that our European interests and values can be properly represented. Simply put, we need to stop relying on others. But what do you think? Especially our American viewers, as this is very much an EU perspective. And if you like the content, please subscribe and like the video. Lastly, please consider supporting the channel with Patreon. Your support will help us break even and keep the channel going. Thank you Andras, Forza Azuri, Sean, Kanzel, and Louise for your support already. See you in the next video.